just to start out, to set the scene, could you describe the view from Sheepeater?
Sure. So I usually had the desk pointing off to the south, so looking out across kind of the western edge of Chamberlain Basin as it goes up toward Mosquito Ridge, looking out Mosquito Ridge and down toward kind of the Big Creek, the hills that go over into Big Creek that I couldn't see over the top of. And then coming around to the west, the South Fork of the Salmon's down over there, and you can't see down to the river because Little Sheepeater Ridge is in the way, but you can see the mountains over here on kind of the McCall district. See a few different lookouts over here, and then as you bank around into the north, then you're looking at Oregon Butte over on the Nez, and kind of the entirety of like Mallard Creek and Dixie and whatnot, and then up Boston Mountain and Sheep Hill, Bargaman Basin. And then I almost have to turn around in my chair to do this since I started in one spot. And then as you come off the main and over into the east, and the other thing that's on the north as you're in closer is Trout Point and whatnot. You know, the last little bit of the point, they're dropping down toward the middle, or toward the main salmon, and so you got a little range of mountains kind of on your side, and then dropping around to the east, you've got mostly Chamberlain Basin, and all the way to where it comes up to the high point above the Middle Fork, and kind of closes off that side. Although you can see the Bighorn Crags off in the distance over there too. Yeah.
Could you walk me through what one day as a fire lookout is like?
Sure. Usually had the alarm to go off at 7, whether you need it or not, because it was light out. You know, you get roasted out of your sleeping bag early in the summer, and get up, go down to the outhouse, come back, get the dog, and go for a walk of some kind in the morning. And usually just couple miles out and back, or if I needed to haul water, I'd go down and haul water because it was nice and cool in the morning. And then come back, get on the radio, call the other lookouts, check in at starting time, and usually at 9 o'clock. And then before or after check-in, depending on how long the walk took, then I'd make myself my coffee and some breakfast, and start the official work day. And so kind of in between check looks, which, officially when you're on the clock, I think you're supposed to do every 15 minutes or what. And I just check when, regularly throughout the day. I mean, you look up, you're looking out all the dang time, and you're looking up when you're not on the clock and whatever. So in between looking for smoke, tracking the weather, I did a lot of reading, crosswords, studying plant medicine, whatnot, writing, some drawing and painting, whatnot. I don't know. It's always crazy at the start of the season. You get up there and you're like, how do I spend all my days? I'm not really sure. And then they just flow together and go. You think about what you're going to eat for lunch. Think about what you're going to eat for dinner. And then you have an hour off for lunch when you can technically leave the top of the lookout again if you want to. Might go for a little walk then or not, depending on how hot it was. And then through the afternoon, kind of the same thing. And clock out at 1700, call the other lookouts, and then you're done for the day. Then it was time to go make a gin and country time lemonade and take the dog for another walk down the hill. A lot of August and especially August and into September, you often got extended until not 1700, we were on until 1800 anyway, and then got extended 1900, 2000. You might start an hour earlier in the morning. The day might be kind of no downtime for yourself at all, that you might just be conversing with the fire on the ground, or the crews on the ground, and or looking for smoke, watching lightning. Yeah, just kind of depended. But
how many years were you on as a fire lookout?
6 altogether. I was on Sheep Hill up on the Nez in 2010. That was my first year, and that one got budget cut. It hasn't been reopened since. And after that, I managed to get on a lookout on the Okanagan Wenatchee in Washington for 1 year, and then that one got budget cut. And I was like, well, this is how my life is going to be. I thought I got to be a lookout, and I was wrong. And then I had 1 year off fishing in Alaska, and then the Crasshole district here had an opening, and so 1 year on Williams Peak above the South Fork and the Secesh, and the East Fork at the South Fork. And after that, the guy who'd been on Sheepeater for about the last 7 years, I think, he and his wife became the caretakers of Bergdorf Hot Springs and decided to stick with that. And he called me in January and asked me if I would consider being a Sheepeater lookout, because frankly, the idea of anyone else sleeping in my bed gives me the creeps. So I was like, all right, heck yeah, Sheepeater, absolutely, back in the wilderness, just across the main salmon from the very first lookout I'd ever worked at, and it was awesome. So I was there for 4 years, and then stopped to work here at Moss. So 6 years altogether. I don't know if I said that the first time. Sorry, meant to lead off with that.
No, you're good. What kept you going back?
It is my favorite job I've ever had, and I kind of didn't want to do anything else, and I still don't. If I could afford health insurance and not have to work in McCall in the winter, I would go be a fire lookout again, for sure. So just being absolutely more satisfied with my livelihood and living than I have ever been in any other position. That's what kept me going. Yeah.
What is the role of a fire lookout to you?
Well, in addition to the textbook looking for smoke, monitoring fire, tracking the weather, tracking lightning strikes, it is a lot of communications, at least on this forest, a lot of communications with the district, telling them about what's going on with storms. Lookouts sometimes make the difference between whether all of the resources on the entire forest stay on past 1800, because we're seeing storms or clouds building in the afternoon that mean that we should really maybe have resources on longer than average. So communicating weather, communicating a lot of times out there in the wilderness anyway, you've got fires that are in monitor status, so you're keeping track of what's going on there, reporting that back. Or if you've got fires that are staffed, and then talking to the crews on the ground. You can see so much more than they can. You can see if the wind is changing, if you've got weather moving in, if the fire's starting to do something that maybe they can't see from the ground. You can keep them informed of what's going on too. So all of those things, in addition to taking care of the building and the grounds, and and then taking care of yourself, chop wood, carry water, kind of existence. Yeah.
Is the fire lookout symbolic of anything to you?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't know. That one's a little deep. I mean, it is in the sense that when I was about 8 years old, I found out that fire lookouts existed, and I kind of found out about it in the historical sense that the mountain out our front door had been a fire lookout, and a gal who had staffed it during World War II had written a book about her experience. And so I didn't really get the book when I read it at the time, but I got the gist of it, and I was like, I want to be one of those. and then later years, high school, reading Jack Kerouac and the Dharma Bums, and reading about like this Jaffe Ryder character, and like, who's that guy? Oh, that's Gary Snyder, also a fire lookout and a total badass, and whatnot. So these icons who were fire lookouts, and kind of like in that historical sense just seem larger than life, I guess, and so in some way I feel like getting to be a lookout, getting to be at a lookout, is getting to actually partake in kind of this like mythical existence that it doesn't really exist in a lot of places anymore, but it still does here, and I got to be one, and that's pretty freaking rad. Yeah.
So, as we move away from fire lookouts, it kind of becomes, obsolete in a way as new technology is implemented. Do you feel like that transition away from the human staff fire lookout, do you think anything is lost in that transition?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for one, it's usually cheaper to staff a lookout for the summer than it is to put an aerial resource up whenever you've had a lightning bust. So that's kind of a thing. That it's a shift in how budgets can be, kind of sold, I guess. And it also, you lose all of that human commo between the person who's there all of the time versus the people, maybe the resources who've just responded to a fire, or some jumpers who aren't even from this forest who got chucked out and they need an idea of how to hike out best, and you can give them real time on the ground experience of where, knowledge of where they should maybe head. That weather watching, the fact that the cameras in particular, will catch smoke, and they're getting better at it, but generally it's not nearly as little smoke as a lookout's going to notice in their day of watching out there. And you wind up with bigger fires generally before the cameras pick them up than the human would, because it takes kind of a lot of smoke. Like if it's if it's at the time when a camera can see it, it's usually beyond a spot, unless it's in some really unusual timber or something like that. Yeah. And also, lookouts track the lightning where it came in the first place, so like you're looking for smoke to arise for weeks afterward in these spots that lightning hit. So you just kind of have a little bit of advanced knowledge on things. I think that loses a lot.
So thinking about the spaces that fire towers are in,
Mm-hmm.
do you think there's a relationship between the fire lookout and the wilderness?
Ask that again. Sorry.
Yeah. Do you think that the concept of wilderness in Idaho,
Mm-hmm.
as a wild space, that's sort of as free from human interference as possible?
Sure.
Do you think that there's any sort of relationship between the reality of wilderness and what the fire lookout is?
Sure, like just a disconnect between the two things, or a connect either way.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing comes to mind is like, here in Idaho we have the largest, we have the Frank Church, and then the 50-yard corridor between it with the Magruder Road, and then the Selway Bitterroot, and then the the Gospel Hump is just right there off to the side, separated by a few dozen miles. But all of those have airstrips grandfathered into them, right? So and private in holdings that are still in the centers of them. And so as far as like humans and structures on the ground that don't fit the wilderness structure as it's written and everything like that, there are already a lot of exceptions here, but I think they're a little more truthful maybe than I don't know. I think humans kind of should be out there a little bit. Humans would be out there if we hadn't chased the Takadika out of out of the church, and blah blah blah. The history there is that people were on the ground, since the late 1800s too, which in Idaho terms is ancient history. Lookouts started being up there in the early 1900s, so as far as West Coast history, they kind of belong. But yeah, they're an exception. All of my lookouts had solar panels, so I had propane stove, propane or solar fridge. I had the ability to hook my iPod and my coffee grinder into into the battery bank, and and kind of live it up. I had ice cubes at most of my lookouts because, again, the refrigeration that I had available to myself. That's kind of crazy and totally different than, of course, what it was for decades and decades and decades. I had just enough phone service that I could text and even make phone calls, to the outside, to friends and family, instead of just being confined to the radio or the crank telephone. So it's a whole different deal than it used to be, but I think it still just kind of fits. The other thing is, well, here, Crassel only has Sheepeater left as a lookout. I mean, the Payette only has Sheepeater left as a wilderness lookout. Salmon Chalice has a couple. I guess the Clear Nez has a few, right, kind of sprinkled in. But so many more of them are more front country lookouts or outside of the wilderness than used to be, I guess. I really wandered around a lot there. I'm not sure I really answered any kind of question. But it was kind of a funny question, too, and I didn't know where to go with it, so.
Yeah.
That's the one that I'm like, tonight I'm going to be like, yeah.
You can email me.
There's a thought. Yep.
What do you miss most about being a fire lookout?
I miss feeling that fulfilled in my work. I am good at the job I do here at Moss, and I'm content in it enough that I haven't left, and also I get health insurance. But when I'm stressed out here, it's not the same as being stressed out on the lookout. When I'm stressed out on the lookout, it's because of the fact that, like, fires are just really going off, or there's a ton on my plate, and I've got a lot to keep track of and keep straight and deliver well over the radio or over the phone, succinctly and what have you. And I feel just like freaking crushing it, superwoman at it, instead of being kind of like resentful that I have to do this thing. Like, I'm going to do it and I'm going to do a good job, but I don't want to do it. There, I always wanted to do the work. So I miss that a lot. And I'm going to get choked up. I just also really miss just getting to live on a freaking mountaintop all summer long, like you are looking outside or you are outside for 3+ months out of the year, and you know what's going on the land because you're walking on it every day. You know what flowers are blooming, what's done blooming, when the berries are starting to get ripe, whether the fish are rising down in the lake, yeah, where the elk are at, where the wolves are at. And I miss that a lot. when I first came here, well, when I made the decision, I cried a lot, to the decision not to go back, because I had to make it in the winter that I wasn't coming back for the summer, and I cried a lot. And then I cried less until fire season started, and then I cried a bunch. And then things, just random things, whether it was like light or smells or just realizing something that I missed, would just freaking sideswipe me for years. You know, it's like 2 or 3 years later, it was spring, and we had some of the trail crew were over for dinner, and they were about to go out into the wilderness, and we were playing yard games in the yard, and I just stuck my hands in my back pockets. It wasn't years, it was only a year or two later. Stuck my hands in my back pockets, these shorts I hadn't worn in a while, and in my back pocket was this coil of not horsehair, mule hair that I'd gotten from one of my favorite mules when I'd shut down the lookout at the end of what turned out to be my last season, and hiked out to Big Creek. And I knew I needed some new horsehair for the firefinder, for the crosshairs, the literal crosshairs on the firefinder. And so I went and found my favorite mule and got a few hairs from her. And yeah, and this, like, standing there in the backyard looking at this coil of hair in my hand, and just like, just broken, you know, over the fact that that wasn't my existence anymore. But all these kids that I'm playing freaking games with get to go out there in like 2 weeks. Jerks. So yeah, that's what I miss about it. And a lot of other things too. There's one more thing. You have so much time to be in your own head. I was able to process so many things, you know, like on an emotional, mental, what the hell am I doing with my life, you know, spiritual level, that I remember standing in the kitchen here, not my first summer, but my second summer, when a former smoke jumper is our facilities manager here now, and I was like, John, I still haven't figured out how people in like real life process anything. Like, I don't think I'm going to have any major epiphanies about myself or my existence for the rest of my life, because I don't have all this time in the summer to do it anymore. And I don't get to read as much either, but yeah.
Thanks, Betsy.
Yeah, you bet. Sorry, didn't mean to get all verklempt.
That was really
Great.
Yeah. I mean, I have a couple of stragglers, but do you guys want to interject with some questions? I'm sure you have some.
I've got two. Go ahead. I guess, so I've got two. The first one is, I think you've kind of already answered this, but I'm curious if you could kind of speak more specifically to what you gained as an individual from that lifestyle and that occupation.
Wow. Yeah, I definitely kind of feel confident taking almost anything on, I guess, you know, that you're up there, you're remote, you have the supplies that are inside the building, whether they're the, you know, the food and the books and whatever that you brought for yourself to get through the summer, or it's the tools and the random old broken pieces and maybe some new things that are stored in the lookout for 80 years and forward. But that's what you have to work with. You know, you have hand tools to repair whatever needs to be repaired. And so being able to just, you know, sit and look at something for a while and work out how I'm going to fix it with kind of limited resources is a big thing that really, really translates out into so much work. Like this winter I took on being the acting facilities manager here, and that was a lot, but I was like, I can do it. And I could, as it turns out, not as well as our usual guy, but so that was a pretty big thing. Like, I feel pretty freaking confident in it, and just otherwise, yeah, feeling like I could really suss out my life and where I want to be and where I was headed, and having a little bit more of a lodestar as to like where I'm going, even though I'm not sure how exactly, what path it'll take to get there. Like, not going to settle for something that I'm not content doing. and having a better idea of what's genuinely going to make me content, what just seems like a good idea at the time. That sucked. Better idea, or better ability to recognize that from the get-go instead of when it's kind of like too late. Yeah.
Can you recall some of your favorite memories from your time as a lookout? Your favorite moments?
Sure. Yep. 3 of them come to mind. 1. There are others too, but these are the first 3 things that came to mind. 1, I was still in my sleeping bag on the bunk one morning when something like fell out of the sky outside the window and thwapped onto the catwalk. Like, what the hell was that? Sat up and looked outside, and it's a squirrel, like a tree squirrel, just like, what's going on? And I was like, holy shit. And there were ground squirrels up there, and they didn't usually come up on the catwalk, but they would sometimes. And here's this freaking tree squirrel that obviously got dropped. It was supposed to be breakfast and got dropped by somebody flying over. And it was just standing there like, no idea, like ran one way, ran the other, couldn't figure out how to get off the catwalk. And so I, went out and guided it down the stairs. That was pretty awesome. Boy, the other one just got supplanted. So my first summer, it was my first year doing this thing that I thought that I'd always wanted to do. And so I was like, well, we're going to find out whether or not it really is what I want to do. And so many things about that first summer were more incredible, really, than other years. I had more incredible storms. I had more incredible sunsets. I had more wildlife, more fancy wildlife. But that first year I had mountain goats and bighorn sheep and bears, and as well as, I never saw the wolves, just heard the wolves. I never saw a bighorn, mountain goat, or a bear at the lookout again. I saw other things. I saw foxes or chucker or what have you, elk, but I never got to see the kind of the high mountain animals again. So that was pretty freaking neat. And then also that first year, I can't remember, I feel like maybe I told you this story before, but I can't remember why I would have done during that other interview. But the very best storm that I have ever been in, most of the storms around here track kind of up from the south. They might come a little bit from the southeast or a little bit from the southwest, but out of the south. And one afternoon in August, there's just this wall of black out to the west, and just boiling over toward me, and you could see like it was blocking out all the light because it was in the west and the sun was over there, and just you could see in the kind of like what should have still been broad daylight, lightning just dropping out of this thing all the way across, like as it came across both the Payette and the Nez, and like Oregon Butte got lit up, and then it came across Dixie, and then it came across Boston Mountain, and across Bargaman, and then it's right there. Like it is just, and it was a shelf cloud, so it was all squared off at the leading edge because it was just moving so fast. And I was like, that thing, and I'm sitting on my lightning stool in the middle of the lookout, like that thing is below the elevation of this mountain. That's going to have to that's just going to have to lift up to get over here. And so it did. When the wall of air in front of that cloud finally hit Sheep Hill, it just boiled up and over me. This cloud just kind of like washed all around me, and still dropping lightning, and there was just enormous hail, like dime size or a little bit bigger hail, and still lightning, just going on all around me. And the lookout either got hit or came, like splash over from a strike that was right nearby, and it was crazy. It was so awesome, just like being literally in the middle of the storm for however long it took. felt like a while, but it was probably like 15 minutes or something like that I was just like, woo hoo hoo hoo. That was real rad. Yeah. There you go.
You mentioned the Beats earlier, who are a pretty macho or wannabe macho bunch,
Sure.
and
Not as macho as Ed Abbey. But
yeah, yeah.
or that guy who wrote that. Anyway, go ahead, sorry.
No, and I get the sense that lookout culture seems pretty masculine, and I'm wondering if you've ever encountered any resistance as a female lookout.
That's a great question. Yeah, and it's funny because there have been a lot of female lookouts through the years too, right? Like World War II, there were actually a relatively large number of them. And I would say, yeah, it's been at least a third female lookouts, I think, most places I've been. But at the same time, I think I've gotten less strife being a female lookout per se as so much as like being a female in fire, that on the Nez in particular, that it seemed, yeah, I mean, it was just kind of, you're just discredited just a little bit, you know. And it was also my rookie year as a lookout, so fair enough, you know, they had the right to doubt me. But 6 years later, my last season, when I'm on Sheepeater across the way from them, you know, calling over to say that I've got a smoke, you know, that Oregon Butte can't see, and they're like, oh yeah, you know, the lookouts are talking about some smoke up by Green Mountain. There's been fire up there for ages, and they went up and sure shit, there was a 50-acre fire that they just couldn't see because of all the smoke that had been laid in for a couple of weeks, you know, kind of that dismissiveness that I experienced there and from there after I was here. But that's really about the biggest of it, you know. And when I was a firefighter on the ground, same thing kind of there, that it was just a little bit dismissive. The Payette's pretty rad, though, as far as fire is concerned entirely, that there are way more women in leadership roles on this forest, and 2 female lookouts got Firefighter of the Year one year for our assistance we were able to give to a couple of really big fires and things like that. So I personally haven't experienced too much, which is pretty great. You get the odd old dude male lookout who thinks you're, you know, useless, and he can't figure out how to scan his radio, and he won't take any advice from anybody, which is pretty obnoxious. But, you know, that's thankfully a little less common too. Yeah, and this forest is just kind of unusually supportive all the way around. It's not a competitive thing either, so much that, you know, you see a smoke and you actually call somebody for a cross on it, because then your location will be accurate, instead of like, that's my smoke, I'm calling it in, especially if I got it on your territory. A little less of that. Yeah.
Is the mule or horsehair crosshair, is that standard practice, or did somebody teach you that for the firefinder?
Sure, that's traditional practice. Like, that's, I think, what Osborne, you know, intended to have be used, and because it was a readily available thing, you know, that you usually had pack strings coming up to the lookouts and stuff like that. Some folks use just black thread instead. Same, a little less breakable. And fishing line, but fishing line's tough because, you know, it's so like, I don't like it because it's clear-ish, you know, so it kind of just gets fuzzy instead of being as particular. But yeah, horsehair works great, kind of awesome, plus tradition.
Especially when it comes from a favorite mule.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah.
What does time feel like out there?
Perfect. It's there's not a sense of urgency, because you know what your existence is. And the only time I've experienced it outside of being on the lookout, and I don't know how to describe it well. I want to describe it well, but I'm not sure I can. But the only time I've experienced it outside of the lookout was I used to work in the North Cascades in the winter, and one like Sunday, there was an avalanche across the road below where I lived and below the learning center where I cooked. And so the busload of kids that were supposed to arrive on Monday couldn't get up the road through this avalanche. And I was like, this is awesome. I can't leave here. Nobody else can get here. I don't have to go to work. At the lookout, you're just already at work. And it was so great that it just took all of the like things I should be doing right now away. And it was just existing for a couple of days. And it was crazy because they called us when the road reopened, like maybe Wednesday of that week or something like that. And I didn't have plans to go do anything, but I like as soon as that call came in, I could almost audibly hear my brain and my whole system just spool up like, oh, well, I can get out, so maybe I should go down valley and get this thing accomplished that, that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise on the weekend. And really, really crazy. Just how weird it was to feel it spool up like that. Like usually you get off the lookout, you either hike off or you hike down and you get flown back into town, and it feels like this kind of sudden jarring thing, but it's in steps. And yeah, time is just what it is. You've got a structure to your day. You know when your day is going to start and when your day is going to end and when your lunch hour is, and you know the chores you have to get done outside of those times. You know how many miles you can move in an hour and how far you can get if you actually get a day off, and or if you have an hour in the morning, how far you can go before you have to be back. You're going to have to feed yourself, and you're going to have to look for fire, and you're going to have to interact when the fire happens. And it's just simple. It feels a little bit more to me, I think, like subsistence type living must have felt when it's like, yeah, you're gonna go out and take care of the crops and the animals and whatever, and then you're gonna harvest and you're gonna put everything away, and that's just what you're doing. That's what you have to do. You don't have to worry about freaking a call in a while or a meeting or I don't know, getting to the store or getting all the way to Boise to the store because you don't have something that you can't get up here. Whatever, this is your existence. Yeah.
I have. Oh.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
This might be pushing it a little bit, but earlier you mentioned something about the indigenous inhabitants of the space that you were occupying as a lookout, which suggested an awareness that people had inhabited this space before, and that they had kind of unfortunately been forced out. And I'm wondering what it was like for you to be in that space as a lookout and to be aware of that to the extent that you are.
Yeah. I hate to say that it probably wasn't a constant awareness. It was just a every once in a while awareness. You're moving on ground that people have moved across for a really long time. And there's the Three Blaze Trail, which is the earliest mining trail and all that stuff. So finding traces of that, or finding traces of what looked like cairns, like really intentionally placed cairns that were in the middle of frickin' nowhere, relatively speaking, like away from trails and things like that maybe were route finding cairns or cairns of importance or what have you. I have no idea. And just realizing that depth of history on the ground. And Sheepeater, especially from Chamberlain Basin, Sheepeater is a fairly prominent peak, not like Pilot Peak or something like that, but it's a fairly obvious peak out there, and it's named Sheepeater, which is not what the Takadika called themselves. Like, what the heck did they call that mountain? I'm sure it had a name because it's kind of this prominent spot that you can get on top of. I have no idea, and just always wondering about things like that. Like, Chamberlain Basin itself is a really kind of a funny land feature, and what was its name? Did it have a name? Yeah, and that conflict with wilderness and man being excluded from wilderness, which I think is really great for a bunch of honkies. We should probably be excluded for the most part, but that it also kind of by letter excludes the people whose like land it is something that I don't know, feel pretty conflicted about and just think about and have another conversation about every year with the grads when we take them out to Taylor Ranch and stuff. But it's kind of a weird feeling. Being an interloper too, I'm only there for 3.5 months and then gone. Never spent winter in Chamberlain Basin, let alone at the top of an 8,000 foot peak, which nobody would have done in their right mind anyway. So, yeah.
We forgot to ask you to introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. Shall I do it now?
Yeah.
Patch it in. Nice work. That's because I was talking about armpits. What should I say?
Just your name, where you're from, and how your what your connection to Fire Lookouts is.
Okay. My name is Betsy Booth. I live in McCall, Idaho, and I grew up in Eastern Oregon and Western Washington. So mountain territory. I became a fire lookout when I was 30, and I'd always wanted to be one, so I achieved my goals. There you go.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much,
Yeah,
Betsy.
thanks,
That was
Betsy.
amazing. Yeah.
Heck yeah. Thank you.